Milwaukee was incorporated as a city in 1846, about 70 years after the earliest white settlers had arrived, and countless years after the Potawatomi Indians had dotted the area with small villages. By 1860, Milwaukee had become a thriving city. Salesmen arrived at the Union Depot on Reed Street south of the Menominee River and needed a way to reach the main downtown area. Horse-drawn cars were the answer. By 1880, Milwaukee's population had reached 100,000, and horse-drawn streetcars were operated on several routes, including this one on Wisconsin Street. Horse-drawn cars had become outdated by 1890. They were slow and inefficient for a growing city. Electric cars had become available, and disease spread among the horses. Electric cars were introduced to Milwaukee on the West Side Street Railway and operated from 36th and Wells to East Wisconsin Street. Or was it the Milwaukee Electric Railway that operated the first electric cars on its 6th Street line? No one's quite sure which line operated the first electrics. What we do know, however, is that electric cars quickly replaced all horse-drawn cars throughout the city. Old number 129 operated on Wisconsin Street east of the Milwaukee River and on State Street west of the river. New cars were purchased for the West Side Street Railway between 1890 and 1893. And open cars were frequently used for summer service. During this era, some wealthy individuals had their own private cars for traveling around the city. In 1899, the Federal Building, which is still located on East Wisconsin Avenue, and the Public Library and Museum on 8th and Wisconsin were opened. Streetcars began taking on a more modern appearance as the needs for larger and more efficient streetcars grew with the city. The Milwaukee Brewers joined the American League in 1900, and Alice Chalmers was opened in 1901. Cars like this served those facilities. A money car was used to travel from car station to pick up each day's fare collections. But TMER&L wasn't just streetcars. It was people, too. The entire day shift turned out for this company photo taken in the early 1900s. The crew of number 196 posed with their streetcar at the south end of the Holton Street Viaduct. All early streetcars were two-man cars. A motorman operated the car, and a conductor collected the fares. An even dozen operators stood in front of this Holton Mitchell streetcar at the Kinnickinnick car station. Maintenance crews traveled around Milwaukee in this car in the early years of the 20th century. These tracks on East Water Street were first used by electric streetcars in 1898. Chestnut Street was later renamed Juneau Avenue. Streetcars first ran on Chestnut as early as 1897, though this picture was taken somewhat later. West Water Street was later renamed Plankinton Avenue. This picture looking south shows a Vliet Howell streetcar traveling north on West Water Street around 1905. And this picture looks north along the same thoroughfare. The Iron Block, a building still in existence today on the corner of Water and Wisconsin, looked like this 80 years ago. In 1905, horse-drawn vehicles and streetcars were the only traffic to be seen on East Wisconsin Street. It's interesting to note that the streetcar lines generally preceded homes, businesses, and in some cases roads to the outskirts of Milwaukee. After streetcar tracks were put in place, lots along the streetcar lines became valuable. Builders subdivided farmland and built homes on speculation after car lines were operating. Some car lines appeared to pass through desolate areas in the outskirts of Milwaukee. A relatively built-up suburban area of Milwaukee was called North Milwaukee when this pre-1910 picture was taken. We're looking at 35th Street, just south of Villard Avenue. Looking north from the same spot, we can see how houses were built primarily along the streets on which streetcars operated. This picture shows a 12th and Wisconsin streetcar, just after the line was extended to Silver Spring Road in North Milwaukee in 1907. The east side also had streetcar service before it had houses. This picture was taken at the corner of Webster and Glen. Glen was later renamed Downer Avenue. North along Glen, one could find the Milwaukee Normal School, a teacher training institution. Today, the school is called UW-Milwaukee. Some of the buildings shown here remain to this day. One of the most interesting examples of streetcar service to the distant suburbs was the so-called Daisy Fields line to Fox Point. Track and wire were installed along North Lake Drive and Day Avenue in 1904. A waiting room served as the north terminus of the line. Beer was sold for the many picnickers who took the streetcars out to the Daisy Fields for day-long outings during the summer months. On the way to the Daisy Fields, streetcars passed through open fields and farmland that today serve as the sites of some of Milwaukee's finest homes. Snow on the Daisy Field line could become a severe problem, since drifts in the wide open areas would grow to huge sizes. While service was being extended to the far outer areas of Milwaukee, some important building was going on in downtown Milwaukee. The Public Service Building, which was designed to serve as the corporate headquarters of the TM-ER&L Company and the terminal building for a growing interurban system, was completed in 1905. The building was located between 2nd and 3rd Streets on Sycamore, today called Michigan Street. Interurban trains left the Public Service Building for destinations as distant as Watertown, Kenosha, Burlington, and East Troy. The system of interurban lines radiating from downtown Milwaukee was the great dream of John I. Beggs, who for 25 years served as the resident genius and driving force behind electric rail service for the Milwaukee area. In 1906, the first motion picture theater opened in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Auditorium was dedicated in 1908. At about the same time, we see an interurban departing for Kenosha from the Public Service Terminal Building on Sycamore. En route to its destination, an interurban sometimes encountered some unexpected problems. On the way to Kenosha, the so-called MRK, Milwaukee Racine Kenosha line, passed through downtown Racine. One of the most heavily traveled interurban routes was the Milwaukee, Waukesha, Waukesha Beach, and Watertown line. In the early 1900s, on very warm Sundays, picnickers rode on open cars to Waukesha Beach. After leaving downtown Milwaukee, the interurbans crossed the Menominee River Valley on the famous Wells Street Viaduct. Just beyond the viaduct, they passed Calvary Cemetery on an elevated line heading west toward Waukesha. In downtown Waukesha, more passengers boarded the westbound trains. Some were heading for Waukesha Beach, others for Oconomowoc and Watertown. Bands greeted arriving visitors at Waukesha Beach. And on busy summer days, particularly Sundays and holidays, many trains lined up on storage tracks, waiting to bring sun-drenched and beer-quenched revelers back to Milwaukee at day's end. Beyond Waukesha Beach, interurbans continued west, here picking up passengers in Delafield, and continuing on to Oconomowoc and Watertown. To the southwest of Milwaukee, interurban service between the Public Service Building and Hales Corners was introduced in 1903. Extension of service to Burlington and East Troy was completed in 1909, but not before encountering this sinkhole west of Muskego Center. On a number of occasions, the entire system of tracks, roadbed, and ties disappeared overnight into the sinkhole. To carry passengers north of Milwaukee, a separate company called the Milwaukee Northern established a line to Port Washington and Sheboygan. Parlor cars on the Milwaukee Northern were elegantly appointed and rivaled the quality of the finest steam lines in America. By 1910, Milwaukee's population had grown to 373,000. Busy north-south streets, such as Washington Street, had taken on the character they would retain right into the 1980s. By the way, we call Washington Street North 27th Street today. Here we see the street, tracks in place, being prepared for paving to accommodate automobile traffic. Washington Street, after a rainstorm, was a virtual swamp in 1910. Entertainment in Milwaukee in 1910 was far different from entertainment today. Amusement parks and beer gardens dotted the Milwaukee scene. One of the best-known amusement parks was Wonderland Park in today's village of Shorewood. Arrival at the park invariably was by streetcar. At night, a brightly lighted arch greeted visitors to the wonderful world of Wonderland Park. Shoot the Chutes was one of the most popular diversions in the park. It was partially located where Hubbard Park stands today. The slide into the water was, of course, into the Milwaukee River. Crowds gathered at Wonderland Park to stroll, sit with friends and family, or enjoy a cool brew on a hot summer afternoon. On 3rd and Burleigh Street, where today the Clinton E. Rose Park is located, there once was an amusement park named Schützen Park. Most large breweries in Milwaukee developed and sponsored beer gardens. Schlitz was no exception. On the corner of 8th and Walnut stood Schlitz Park. Schlitz Park was served by streetcar lines operating along Walnut Street and 8th Street, as well as the nearby 6th Street line. From the tower at Schlitz Park, viewers could get a view of the entire downtown area and of Lake Michigan. For an exciting day away from the city, nothing could beat the Pabst Whitefish Bay Resort. The highlight of the Pabst Resort was this Ferris wheel, brought to Milwaukee from the Chicago World's Fair of 1892. As early as 1900, Wisconsin's State Fair was held in West Allis, where it still is an annual event. Between 1914 and 1920, Milwaukee changed rapidly. It was still a city of beautiful homes and small businesses. Businesses with German names and German architecture still flourished. But World War I was to change Milwaukee forever. Industrialization took over. No longer were horses and wagons to dominate the Milwaukee scene. Large streetcars capable of moving passengers to and from busy industrial plants became the order of the day. Streetcars such as number 312, built in 1903 and here seen at the east end of the Wells Street Viaduct, gave way to more mechanically advanced cars of the 400 series. This car is on Glen, now called Downer Avenue, in front of one of the buildings that is now part of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The end of the North Avenue streetcar line was 31st Street when this picture was taken. Car number 468, shown here, was operating on the Wells-Farwell line. Later in its career, it was paired with a similar unit and rebuilt into a two-car train. The interiors of streetcars of this era, while not luxurious, were comfortable. Coal stoves served as the only source of heat during the winter months. The modern era of streetcars was ushered in with the introduction of the 500 series cars in 1911. Though they were rebuilt as one-man cars in the mid-1920s, many remained in service until 1952. 600 series streetcars entered Milwaukee service in 1913. Though this picture was taken somewhat later, you can see that this is a more modern car in outward appearance. The most unpopular streetcars among the motormen of Milwaukee were the so-called awful 700s. Built originally as center entrance cars, they turned out to be overweight and underpowered. Often operated as two-car trains, breakdowns were frequent because controls tended to freeze on Milwaukee's many sub-zero winter days. We see the interior of an awful 700. Notice the center entrance and the step down to get to that middle door. In 1919, this streetcar was designed and built at the company shops as an experimental streetcar. Number 801 was such a successful experiment that another 199 similar cars were built over the next 10 years. Milwaukee's mass transportation system matured between 1890 and 1920, beginning with horse-drawn cars to early electrics with their displays of sparks and open platforms. Open cars became popular, this one near the City Hall with the Pabst Theater in the background. At the turn of the century, streetcars served many downtown streets. By 1910, streetcars were becoming larger and more comfortable. This spanking new car number 606 was ready to enter service on the 12th Street and Wisconsin line. By 1920, virtually every streetcar line that was ever to exist in Milwaukee was in place. In fact, from 1920 on, streetcar service was on the decline. The 1920s began for Milwaukee with a transportation first. Buses were introduced on West Mitchell Street. As you can see, the first buses were not much to look at. In fact, the first buses weren't much more than a truck chassis on which was mounted a box with windows and doors cut into it. The first streetcar line to be replaced by buses was the Lisbon Car Line, west of Sherman Boulevard. A shelter was constructed at Lisbon and North to protect passengers from the elements as they waited for the buses. By the mid-1920s, buses had become somewhat more comfortable and attractive. Although most streetcars and buses were operated by the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, double-deck buses were introduced on Wisconsin Avenue by a subsidiary company, the Wisconsin Motor Bus Line. At first, the upper deck was open and passengers were subjected to the whims of Milwaukee weather. Later, a convertible top was constructed and placed over the upper deck during Milwaukee's foul weather season, about 11 months of the year. Notice the wooden benches used on the upper deck of bus number 470. A variety of unfavorable conditions put an end to the useful life of double-deck buses. Several of them were rebuilt as freight trucks, one of which we see here. The first buses designed and built with passenger comforts in mind were these twin coach vehicles, introduced into service in 1927. What sort of city did these buses serve in the 1920s? Here are some selected views. We're looking east on Wisconsin Avenue, east of the Milwaukee River. We see a rebuilt articulated streetcar on the busy corner of Plankinton and Wisconsin. Each of the two cars of this train had formerly operated as an individual streetcar. It appears as though every car, bus, streetcar, and wagon had converged on the corner of Clybourne and 6th Street when this mid-1920s picture was taken. Wisconsin Avenue, then called Grand Avenue, was crowded with traffic in this view looking east from 3rd Street. Construction of the Plankinton Arcade was moving along when this 1924 picture was taken. If you look carefully along the right side of the completed Plankinton Arcade, you'll see a bus. The arcade was the terminal for a number of intercity bus companies during the mid-1920s. Track construction and road repairs were taking place on the corner of Plankinton and Wisconsin Avenues when this picture was taken. Notice the Browning King store, long a downtown fixture in the background. Crowds boarded this Wauwatosa-bound streetcar in downtown Milwaukee. The company shops were located on Highland Avenue near Washington Park. Called the Cold Spring Shops, streetcars were built from scratch, and others were repaired in this TMER&L facility. This 600 series streetcar, number 659, was pictured at the east end of the Wisconsin Avenue line, the Northwestern Railroad Depot. Here's a company photo of another 600 series car. This one was being prepared for suburban service to South Milwaukee. 700 series streetcars were originally built as two-man center entrance cars at the Cold Spring shops. They were later rebuilt at the same shops as one-man front entrance cars. Even though they were overweight and underpowered, they continued in regular service until 1948. Also pictured at the Cold Spring shop was this 800 series streetcar. The prototype of this car was designed and built at the shops in 1919. The Lake Park Terminal building was well known to picnickers and others who frequented this beautiful lakefront park. Interurban lines radiating from downtown Milwaukee had reached their maximum size before 1920. What happened in the 1920s was a modernization of cars and track facilities. This Milwaukee-bound interurban was rebuilt to look like this during the mid-1920s. The Milwaukee Northern Line was incorporated into the Milwaukee Electric Rapid Transit Line in 1928, and cars such as this were rebuilt to conform to the appearance of the rest of the fleet. This Kenosha-bound interurban was photographed at South Junction in 1929. Breakdowns on streetcar lines were not uncommon in the 1920s. Passengers could be delayed for hours until service was restored. Undoubtedly, at a time like this, frustrated passengers would have gladly agreed to the replacement of all streetcars by buses. The 1930s. If any one thing could be looked on as the transportation hallmark of the 1930s, it would be the transition from rail to rubber tire transportation in Milwaukee. Buses took on a variety of appearances. Some were massive, like this so-called Queen Mary bus, introduced into service in 1931. By the way, the nickname Queen Mary was given to the bus by the drivers. Whether viewed from the front or the back, the Queen Mary bus was an imposing vehicle. By contrast, some small buses were needed for service on lightly used feeder lines. For example, the Lloyd Street Extension line was served by this small twin-coach bus, pictured at 60th and Lloyd in 1934. What later came to be known as GM buses were originally built by the Yellow Coach Company. Here's a 1934 model. Twin Coach introduced its Model 23R in 1935. The 23 referred to the seating capacity of the bus. At the time, this bus was considered state-of-the-art. An interior view of the 23R will give you some idea of the comfort and luxury built into these buses. A somewhat larger version of the 23R was this Model 30 twin coach, purchased for service on cross-city feeder lines in 1936. This rather odd-looking GMC bus was purchased in 1937 for use in Milwaukee and Racine. It's interesting to note that TMER&L owned the Racine Bus Company at the time. Another very small bus was this one, built by Ford and introduced into service in 1937. A more advanced model Ford bus with a passenger carrying capacity of 27 was this 1939 model. This 1940 GMC bus was the last model purchased from the automotive giant before the start of the Second World War. Returning to rail transportation, here's a most unusual picture. This 1930 photo was taken by the builder, the St. Louis Car Company, during the construction of 10 articulated trains for South Milwaukee suburban service. This is the interior of one of the cars before seats, dome lights, and side panels were put into place. And here is the finished product, brand spanking new and ready for delivery from St. Louis to Milwaukee. This is an exterior view of the double streetcars in this company-posed publicity shot. These were the last streetcars ever to be purchased for service in Milwaukee. A strike by company workers in 1934 proved to be costly to everyone involved. While many workers took to the picket lines, others continued on the job. Passengers and motormen had to be protected from rock throwers. Angry strikers damaged streetcars. Police and company officials tried to move pickets out of the way so that streetcars could leave the car stations. As the strike continued, anger was followed by action. 200 policemen were called to restore order at the Kinnickinnick car station after several hours of rioting. Picket lines were organized to prevent streetcars from leaving car stations. The strike ended only after life was lost in an effort by angry workers to storm the Lakeside Power Plant in St. Francis. Once service was restored, life returned to normal as we view the heavy traffic on Wisconsin Avenue, just west of 6th Street. The same view of 6th and Wisconsin shows the Mariner Tower and the large number of movie theaters that were located along Milwaukee's main street in the 1930s. The corner of 35th Street, Burleigh, and Fond du Lac Avenue was a busy part of a quiet mid-1930s residential neighborhood. Except for the older autos, the 500 series streetcar and the car tracks, this 1937 picture of Wells Street appears to have been taken yesterday, or maybe the day before. The public service building served not only as the electric company headquarters, but also as the terminal building for Milwaukee's interurban lines and South Milwaukee suburban service. Buses served some of Milwaukee's finest neighborhoods. This is a view of tree-lined Prospect Avenue in 1938. The heavy auto traffic was due to the closing of Lincoln Memorial Drive for repairs at the time. A new form of transit vehicle was introduced to Milwaukee in 1936, the trackless trolley. These high-speed, almost silent electric buses captured the imagination of Milwaukeeans when they were introduced on the crosstown North Avenue line. Crowds pushed onto the trolley buses to get a ride on the first day of service, October 9th, 1936. The first trackless trolleys were built by the Twin Coach Company. In many ways, the design and appearance of these trolleys were very similar to the Twin Coach gasoline buses that dominated the Milwaukee transit scene. The second batch of trackless trolleys arrived in Milwaukee in 1937 and were built by the St. Louis Car Company. They were introduced into service on the 35th Street line on October 23, 1937. This is the way trackless trolleys were brought to Milwaukee from the manufacturer. This is a 1939 model Twin Coach. The 1930s and the Great Depression marked the beginning of the end of interurban service for Milwaukee. Here is an interurban car on the Sheboygan line crossing the Hampton Avenue Bridge on Milwaukee's far north side. Cars stopped in Grafton to pick up and drop off passengers traveling between Milwaukee and Sheboygan. Some cars on the Milwaukee-Sheboygan line were designed as parlor cars. They took on the appearance of an elegantly appointed living room. This is the interurban terminal in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Service to Sheboygan ended in 1940 when the line was cut back to Port Washington. Here is the interior of a Milwaukee Electric Line's interurban coach. Soft leather seats, walnut paneling, and high speeds made these cars some of the most highly regarded of their kind in the United States. An interurban car in Oconomowoc in the late 30s. Service to the west of Milwaukee once reached all the way to Watertown, but was cut back to Oconomowoc in 1940, and then to Waukesha in 1941. This is the terminal building that marked the southernmost point of Milwaukee Electric Line's interurban service. The Kenosha Terminal was opened in 1932. The 1940s. As the saying goes, out with the old. And in with the new. These trackless trolleys arrived in Milwaukee shortly before the start of World War II. Some transit vehicles were given special paint jobs. These cars and buses carried messages of the era. Crowds were the order of the day during the Second World War. Gasoline was rationed, so public transport had to carry the load. Double streetcars were pressed into service and loaded to the gunnels with passengers. At defense factories, crowds were enormous at starting and quitting times. Downtown Milwaukee was the city's busiest shopping area at this time. This picture was taken just before Christmas of 1943. As the decade wore on, crowds continued to jam into the downtown area and the streetcars that served it. Some of Milwaukee's streetcars were nearing the end of their useful existence. This 500 series car, operating on the Oakland-Delaware line, was one of them. The last of the two-man streetcars was retired in 1948. At the time, all of them operated on the 3rd and Greenfield line. Retired and waiting for the cutter's torch were these 600 series cars. One car was spared the torch for a while. It was used to carry workers to the Lakeside Power Plant in St. Francis. This was the last streetcar to operate on 3rd Street. The year was 1948, and soon trackless trolleys would replace these old clanking cars. The old and awful 700 cars had been in service for over 30 years when this picture was taken at 35th and Silver Spring. The massive size of the 700s is apparent in this picture. The greatest complaint of motormen about the 700s was that the cars were very sensitive to the weather. Cold and snow did them in almost every time. We see an 800 series streetcar on North Water Street. The City Hall is in the background. Tippecanoe was the name given to the area at the south end of the Howell Avenue car line. This scene is Howell and Howard, not far from Mitchell Field. South Water Street tracks were relocated and rebuilt, even though plans to abandon all streetcar service were already well underway. Not far from Walker's Point, we see a 900 series streetcar operating on the Oakland Avenue line. During Milwaukee's winter snows, sweepers such as this one traveled throughout the city, keeping the car lines open. The first new bus to arrive in Milwaukee after the end of the war was this GM-built bus. Shortly after the arrival of the GM buses, the transport company took delivery of this post-war twin-coach vehicle. This 1947 publicity photograph shows the company's most recent acquisitions, 2 gasoline buses and a trackless trolley. Milwaukee's last new trackless trolleys were purchased in 1948 for service on the 3rd Street line. It snowed on the December day in 1948 when the new trackless trolleys entered service on the 3rd South 13th line. People lined 3rd Street to welcome trackless trolley service in 1948. At the time, they couldn't know that in a few years, this would be the last line on which electric buses would operate. During the early 1940s, interurban service experienced a revival. Due to the war, every car owned by the company was pressed into action. More passengers were carried during this period than ever imagined possible by early planners of the interurban lines. An interurban at the Racine Terminal. Notice the bright color scheme introduced in the 1940s. This duplex train is southbound out of Racine en route to Kenosha. Late in its career, we see an interurban at the Kenosha Terminal. Service to Kenosha ended in September 1947. A Milwaukee-bound interurban crosses a bridge over the Menominee River Valley. This spot is just a stone's throw from Milwaukee County Stadium today. A severe decline in business followed the end of World War II. Lines to Racine and Kenosha were abandoned, as was the Port Washington route. In an effort to save what was left of the system, lightweight cars were purchased from Cleveland, Ohio in 1949. The South Milwaukee suburban cars were taken out of storage, repainted, and pressed into local service. Additional lightweights were purchased and repainted. The new line was called Speed Rail. The interior of one of the newly acquired cars. There's no comparison between this and the rich, warmly paneled interiors of the old heavyweights. Let's take an imaginary ride on the speed rail to Hales Corners. We pull out of the Public Service Building terminal at 3rd and Michigan. After a short run on city streets, we find ourselves on the rapid transit right-of-way at 16th Street. At 27th Street, we pass an old heavyweight standing on a siding. The smells of the Red Star Yeast Company cannot be missed. Just beyond 35th Street, we pass an inbound lightweight. Past West Junction, where the Waukesha-bound cars turn off to the right, we near Brookdale Road. The end of the line, North Cape Road, just southwest of Hales Corners proper, marks the turnback point of the line. Back at the Public Service Building, 2 articulated units wait in reserve, just in case a larger than expected crowd should show up for today's rush hour. Just north of the interurban right-of-way stood the well-known Wells Street Viaduct. Streetcars used this bridge for more than 50 years. A number of company buses and cars were growing old. This trio of buses was waiting for the torch. The venerable 500 series cars were at the end of the line as far as their useful life was concerned. They served Milwaukee well from 1911 to 1950. The roof fell in, or fell off, of this 500 at the Oakland Car Station, where many of the cars in this series were scrapped. Waiting for their turn to meet the torch were these XS 700 series cars at the Fond du Lac station. In May of 1950, the company scrapped the 700 series cars. Many streetcars were scrapped at a gravel pit just east of Waukesha. What was not salvageable was burned. This is what a streetcar graveyard looks like. In a happier time, a 500-looking showroom new travels westbound on National Avenue. Along Wisconsin Avenue in 1949, some dramatic changes lay ahead for streetcar and bus service in Milwaukee. Though we didn't know at the time as 1950 began, the last days of interurban service were upon us. Speedrail had purchased and refurbished some older lightweight cars from Cleveland, Ohio. The first of these cars was used for limited service to Hales Corners. Things were looking up for Speedrail as the South Milwaukee suburban cars were repainted and pressed into service to Waukesha and Hales Corners. And then it happened. On a bright sunny Saturday, Labor Day weekend, 1950, two chartered trains collided head-on the Hales Corners line. A southbound heavyweight struck a northbound former South Milwaukee articulated. The northbound train was no match for the heavyweight. 10 passengers on the northbound train were killed, and the reputation of the company was damaged beyond repair. Service on the line continued for another 10 months, but insurance coverage became a problem. In the spring of 1951, a court-appointed receiver recommended total abandonment of the system. The last train of former South Milwaukee articulated departed from the Public Service Building on June 30th, 1951. All that remained was the final scrapping of the line: rails, wire, and train cars. These cars were on their way to a Waukesha gravel pit to be turned into scrap metal. Awaiting their turn with the torch were these former South Milwaukee suburban cars. It was well into 1952 before the last of the trains met their ultimate fate. A heavyweight in the foreground and a pile of city streetcars in the back. This is not a pretty sight for electric traction fans. The last of the interurbans were lined up in 2 rows, awaiting their ultimate fate. One by one, cars were brought into the gravel pit. Workers removed salvageable parts, and then the cars were burned so that the scrap metal that remained could be reclaimed and sold. If the useful life of electric interurbans was over by 1951, the life of streetcars was hanging on by a thread. But streetcar service in Milwaukee had one more hurrah before giving up the ghost. In 1953, Major League Baseball came to Milwaukee. County Stadium was built along the West Allis branch of the Wells Street car line. Storage tracks were built on the recently abandoned rapid transit right-of-way. During the games, streetcars lined up by the dozens to take fans to the West Allis or downtown area after the last out was made. The most important days of the Wells car line took place during the World Series of 1957, when the Milwaukee Braves defeated the New York Yankees. Between 1953 and 1956, streetcar lines were abandoned with shocking regularity. First came the Oakland, Delaware, and South 6 lines in 1953. Then the 27th line was converted to diesel buses in 1954. The National Avenue streetcars were replaced by trackless trolleys in 1956. Suddenly, just one streetcar line remained, the Wells Street line. The handwriting was on the wall. Streetcar motormen were to go the way of the dinosaurs. As 1958 approached, streetcar fans recognized that the days of riding those clanging, whirring vehicles would soon be over. Not only did fans ride the cars, they photographed them to retain the memories after the cars were gone. All along the Wells Street line, pictures of streetcars were snapped. Here in West Allis, near 68th and Fairview, at the Blue Mound Road crossing near Milwaukee County Stadium, at 37th and Wells, near the east end of the famous Wells Street Viaduct, in Wauwatosa, along the Milwaukee Road tracks, paralleling State Street, near Jacobus Park, riding the Wells streetcar one more time became the goal of streetcar enthusiasts as March 1958 approached. The Kinnickinnick car station was the last to serve Milwaukee streetcars. On the last sad evening, March 4th, 1958, crowds gathered as streetcar fans strove to ride the last streetcar in regular service in Milwaukee. The final farewell was given at 38th and Wells as city officials and streetcar fans gathered to hear the eulogies. Now, all that was left was the scrapping process. The era of streetcars in Milwaukee had come to an end. In a number of cases, when streetcars were abandoned, they were replaced by trackless trolleys. In fact, used trackless trolleys were purchased from Indianapolis in 1957 to meet the new demand and allow older trolley buses to be retired. Trackless trolleys flourished on the 8th and Muskego line. The 3rd Street and Greenfield Avenue line continued in operation until 1965. Nevertheless, the days of electric transit service of any kind in Milwaukee were rapidly drawing to a close. On the last night of trackless trolley service, we see 2 coaches at 92nd and Lapham about to make their final run to the bus station. A symbolic changing of the guard took place on 3rd and Kilbourne in downtown Milwaukee. Passengers were asked to get off the trackless trolley and climb aboard the diesel bus that was replacing it. Not all of Milwaukee's trackless trolleys were scrapped. Some were shipped by flat car to Mexico City, where they are still in service. For the remainder of Milwaukee's trackless trolley fleet, it was retirement. Eventually, almost all were scrapped. A lineup of abandoned trackless trolleys at a South Side scrapyard. The final fate of the trolley buses was identical to that of Milwaukee's streetcars. Soon, diesel buses became the backbone of Milwaukee's transit fleet, and eventually, they were the only transit vehicles operated by the company. General Motors built diesels were the first to be introduced into service. They served as special shuttle buses circling Milwaukee's downtown area. The first diesels were used on Wisconsin Avenue when streetcars were replaced in 1951. The comfortable buses met with immediate passenger approval. The company liked the diesels because they were so inexpensive to operate, about half the cost of other types of transit vehicles. By 1960, replacement of trackless trolleys and gasoline-driven buses created a need for more diesels. The so-called new-look GM buses made their first appearance on Milwaukee streets and freeways. These buses became the backbone of Milwaukee's transit fleet. Over 400 of the new-look buses eventually joined the fleet. A new paint scheme was adopted in 1975 when the county of Milwaukee assumed ownership of the bus lines from a private corporation. In 1978, another new-look bus was introduced to Milwaukee. Built by the Flexible Company, these buses provided Milwaukeeans with the comfort of air conditioning for the first time. In appearance, the GM and Flexible buses look very much alike. Here is a Flexible that was specially decorated for the Christmas season. Today, the Flexible buses can be seen on lines throughout the city. They are also used for charter trips to sites of interest around Milwaukee. In 1980, the new GM RTS buses were seen for the first time on Milwaukee streets. The RTS buses have become one of the mainstays of Milwaukee's bus fleet. The newest buses to date entered service in 1981. They're built by the Neoplan Company. The boxy appearance of the buses masks the fact that mechanically, these are the last word in modern bus coaches. As the song goes, you've come a long way, baby. Indeed, it's been a long way from the Neoplan buses of the 1980s to the early buses of the 1920s. Then, buses were little more than large trucks with holes cut out for windows and doors. As time went by, buses took on a more modern appearance. Double-decker buses served Milwaukeeans during the 1920s and early 1930s. In 1927, a real breakthrough in bus design and comfort took place. In 1930, the massive Queen Mary buses were introduced into service. By contrast, smaller buses were purchased for new and rather lightly used outlying lines in the early 1930s. In 1935, modern twin coach buses were placed in service on selected lines. 2 years later, Ford-built buses were used in Milwaukee service for the first time. By 1950, These small buses had become worn out and were sold to a local scrap metal firm. The last of the gasoline buses to enter Milwaukee service were these General Motor vehicles and these twin coach buses. By 1951, diesel buses were introduced to Milwaukee and quickly displaced all other types of transit vehicles. As long as we're reminiscing about buses, we ought not to forget Milwaukee's electric buses. Trackless trolleys were first seen on Milwaukee streets on the North Avenue crosstown line in 1936. In 1937, trolley buses were introduced on the north-south 35th Street line. The Holton-Mitchell line was converted from streetcars to trackless trolleys in 1938. In 1939, new trolley buses arrived by flat car from Ohio to increase the size of Milwaukee's fleet and improve service on existing lines. A trackless trolley was dressed up for World War II. In 1947, Milwaukee's first post-war trolley bus arrived on the scene. In 1948, the last of Milwaukee's new trackless trolleys was delivered by the Pullman Standard Company. And within weeks, the new trolley buses put in their appearance on the 3rd Street lines. These trackless trolleys served Milwaukee for just 17 years. The last of them were sold for scrap in 1965. Now that we've viewed the past, what of the future? Articulated buses are or will soon enter service on Milwaukee's heavily traveled lines. Built by Crown Icarus, the new articulateds will be identical to this one. A prototype was tried out on Milwaukee streets before the company placed its order. Even more modern-looking buses may someday find their way into Milwaukee service. Small electric battery-driven buses may be used to shuttle passengers to new rail vehicle lines. The traction lines may take the form of a monorail. They may look like the modern rail cars, such as those used by BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit. Or the Chicago Transit Authority Rapid Transit Lines, which provide fast and efficient service. The Washington, D.C. Metro cars are among the world's most modern and efficient mass transit vehicles. Streetcars, as we've known them, will be called LRVs, light rail vehicles. LRVs will come in a variety of shapes and sizes. They will all be speedy and almost noiseless. LRVs are already being used in regular service in Europe, Japan, and the United States. This LRV carries passengers from downtown Cleveland to eastern suburbs on a private right-of-way. Future LRVs will be even more handsome and efficient. Trains will operate on elevated rail lines. Modern monorails may be used to carry passengers through congested central city areas. And the most modern of all mass transit forms, maglev, may someday serve Milwaukee's needs. Trains operated by an electronic process called magnetic levitation will skim along at speeds up to 275 miles per hour. From a mass transit point of view, we have seen Milwaukee's past. We know where we are and where we've been. The future is less clear. Will we ride on modernistic buses, light rail vehicles, maglevs? Only time will tell.